The morning of June 12, 1943, Leyers Airfield, Eastern Germany. Major Klaus Freilich pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 to a gentle stop on the tarmac and killed the engine. The familiar scream of the Daimler-Benz inverted V12 faded to silence. Through his canopy, he could see it, an impossibility sitting on German soil wearing German national markings. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Tail number 4, 1224585. The Americans called her Wolfhound. Freilich had been shooting at flying fortresses for 8 months. He knew their silhouette better than his own face in a mirror. That distinctive nose, those 4 right cyclone radials, that massive wing spanning nearly 104 feet from tip to tip. But he had never been this close to one, never seen one whole, never walked beneath those engines that could each produce 1,200 horsepower, never stood where American gunners had stood, looking out through plexiglass in the sky where German fighters came to kill them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What he discovered that morning would transform how every Luftwaffe pilot in the Reich approached combat against American heavy bombers. The mathematics of attacking a B-17 formation, he would learn, were written in a stark equation. Getting close enough to kill meant flying into a cone of fire so dense that survival became a matter of seconds and angles. The Americans had built a bomber that didn't just carry bombs to targets. They had built a bomber whose primary defensive weapon was making any attack against it statistically suicidal. 6 months earlier, on December 12, 1942, Wolfhound had been just another B-17F in the 363rd Bomber Squadron, 303rd Bomb Group, Hell's Angels. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger and his crew had departed their base in England that morning as part of a mission against Roun's rail yards in occupied France. The weather briefing had called for clear skies over the target. Intelligence officers had promised moderate fighter opposition. Both predictions proved catastrophically wrong. The formation encountered heavy cloud cover over the channel, forcing bombers to climb and separate to avoid mid-air collisions. By the time they reached the French coast, the tight combat boxes that provided overlapping defensive fire had fragmented into loose groups of individual aircraft. German fighter controllers at their radar stations watched the chaos develop and vectored every available interceptor toward the broken American formation. Flickinger's B-17 took hits from Messerschmitt Bf 110s during the initial fighter pass. 20mm cannon shells tore through aluminum skin and severed hydraulic lines. The No. 3 engine began trailing thick black smoke. Another burst shattered the bombardier's position, wounding the navigator and destroying the Norden bomb site. The oxygen system failed. At 23,000 feet, crew members began suffering hypoxia as they scrambled to connect portable oxygen bottles. Lieutenant Flickinger faced calculations that permitted no good options. Continuing to the target meant flying deeper into France with one engine failing and no oxygen system. Turning back meant exposing his crippled bomber to additional fighter attacks during the long return flight across occupied territory. Attempting to reach neutral Switzerland required navigating through the Alps with degraded controls and wounded crew. Every choice led to probable loss of aircraft and lives. The decision came when the No. 3 engine seized completely, the propeller windmilling uselessly and creating massive drag. Flickinger gave the order to abandon the bombing run and head for the nearest airfield where emergency landing might be possible. Navigator. Calculations showed Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands as the closest suitable runway. The fact that Leeuwarden was occupied by the Luftwaffe made the choice desperate. But physics and altitude loss left no alternatives. Wolfhound crossed the Dutch coast at 9,000 feet, losing altitude at approximately 200 feet per minute. Flickinger extended the landing gear manually after the hydraulic system failed to respond to normal controls. He set up final approach to Leeuwarden's main runway with partial control authority. One engine completely dead, another running rough, and battle damage throughout the airframe, creating unpredictable flight characteristics. The landing was textbook perfect despite the circumstances. Flickinger greased the touchdown, rolled out straight, and brought the massive bomber to a stop on the taxiway. German soldiers surrounded the aircraft within minutes. The crew emerged with hands raised, expecting immediate captivity. They had successfully landed a virtually intact example of America's most important heavy bomber directly into enemy hands. What followed over the next 14 days demonstrated the Luftwaffe's sophisticated approach to technical intelligence. German engineers arrived from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility located near Berlin, with comprehensive photographic equipment and measurement tools. They documented every system, measured every dimension, examined every structural detail. They paid particular attention to items American forces considered classified: the Norden bomb site, now damaged, communication equipment, oxygen systems, supercharger controls, and most importantly, the arrangement and fields of fire of the defensive armament. German ground crew worked methodically to repair Wolfhound's battle damage. They patched the cannon holes in the fuselage, they replaced hydraulic lines, they installed a serviceable engine to replace the seized No. 3. They painted over American markings and applied German national insignia, black crosses outlined in white on wings and fuselage sides, swastika tail flashes on the vertical stabilizer. Within 2 weeks of its forced landing, Wolfhound was airworthy again, now wearing the tactical code DL+XC and carrying Luftwaffe colors. On December 24, 1942, 2 Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighters took position on either side of the captured B-17. The formation lifted off from Leeuwarden and turned southeast toward Germany. German air defense controllers had been notified in advance that a single large aircraft with German escort would be transiting their airspace. Anti-aircraft batteries were ordered to hold fire, regardless of aircraft type identification. The strange formation landed at Rechlin without incident several hours later. Rechlin in late 1942 functioned as the nerve center of Luftwaffe technical evaluation. Here, test pilots flew every new German aircraft type before it entered production. Here, engineers analyzed captured Allied equipment to identify vulnerabilities that fighter pilots could exploit. Here, the Luftwaffe maintained perhaps the most sophisticated aeronautical test facility in Europe, with specialized equipment for measuring everything from control forces to ballistic trajectories to optical gunsight accuracy. Wolfhound became Rechlin's most scrutinized acquisition. Hans-Werner Lerche, the facility's principal test pilot, received the assignment to evaluate the captured bomber's flight characteristics. Lerche had already accumulated thousands of hours in dozens of aircraft types. He specialized in flying without manuals or prior instruction, learning aircraft systems through observation and experimentation. The B-17 presented unique challenges because of its size and complexity, but Lerche approached the evaluation systematically. His first flight in Wolfhound revealed characteristics that surprised German expectations. The B-17 flew by with remarkable stability. The Wright Cyclone engines produced smooth, predictable power across their operating range. The control forces required moderate strength, but provided precise authority. Most impressive was the aircraft's ability to maintain flight with engines shut down. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. During one test flight, an engine malfunction forced Lerche to shut down and feather the propeller. The B-17 continued flying on 3 engines with minimal difficulty, maintaining altitude and responding normally to control inputs. This engine-out capability represented the first significant finding in Recklin's evaluation. German bombers like the Heinkel He-1, 11 or Junkers Ju-88 could survive single-engine failure, but typically with degraded performance that made them vulnerable to fighter attack. The B-17 demonstrated that American designers had built in substantial power margins. A bomber that could absorb the loss of one engine and continue mission execution was a bomber that would be exceptionally difficult to disable with limited battle damage. But the engine-out testing revealed only part of the story. The evaluation that would reshape Luftwaffe fighter tactics began when Recklin's gunnery specialists started analyzing Wolfhound's defensive armament positions. The B-17F carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in 6 positions distributed throughout the airframe, 2 guns in a dorsal turret above and behind the flight deck, 2 guns in a ventral ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 guns in the tail position, single flexible guns in the nose, radio operator's position, and 2 waist positions on either side of the rear fuselage. Each gun could fire 750 rounds per minute with an effective range extending to approximately 600 yards. German weapons specialists had encountered the Browning 50 caliber in previous battles. RAF fighters carried the weapon. British bombers used it in defensive positions. The Germans knew its ballistics, understood its killing power, respected its reliability. What they had not fully appreciated was what happened when 9 of these weapons, operated by trained gunners, created overlapping fields of fire throughout a 360-degree sphere around the bomber. Recklin engineers constructed detailed diagrams showing each gun position's arc of coverage. The dorsal turret covered the upper hemisphere from directly above to well below the horizon line, capable of engaging targets at any bearing. The ball turret provided lower hemisphere coverage, particularly critical because Luftwaffe tactics often included attacks from below where many bombers had blind spots. The tail guns protected the entire rear quarter, the traditional approach vector for fighter attacks. The nose and waist guns covered lateral and forward approaches. When these coverage zones were overlaid on a single diagram, the result showed something unprecedented in bomber design. There was no safe approach vector. Every angle of attack brought an interceptor into the firing solution of at least 2, and often 3 or 4, defensive gun positions, attack from ahead, nose guns, dorsal turret, and potentially both waist guns could engage. Attack from the side, waist guns, dorsal turret, ball turret, and potentially tail guns all had firing solutions. Attack from behind, tail guns, both waist guns, and the ball turret created interlocking fields of fire that any pursuing fighter had to penetrate. The mathematics became even more sobering when German analysts calculated combined rate of fire. 9 guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute, created a theoretical defensive capability of 6,750 rounds per minute. In practical terms, assuming 3 guns could engage any attacking fighter simultaneously, that meant over 2,000 rounds per minute directed at a single target. A typical Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf FW1 190 presented a target area of approximately 100 square feet when viewed from the front or side. Putting 2,000 rounds per minute into a zone containing a 100 square foot target meant that even with poor accuracy, multiple hits became statistically inevitable. German gunnery experts had already calculated, through analysis of wrecked B-17 seconds recovered from various battlefields, that approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells were required to bring down a flying fortress when attacking from the rear. This figure assumed hits distributed across the airframe, striking non-critical systems and accumulating damage until catastrophic failure occurred. 20 hits might sever enough control cables, rupture enough fuel lines, or disable enough engines to render the bomber unflyable. But achieving 20 hits required extraordinary expenditure of ammunition. Luftwaffe studies of gun camera footage showed that pilots of average ability achieved hit rates of approximately 2% when firing at bomber targets. To obtain 20 hits, the average pilot therefore needed to fire 1,020mm rounds. The MG-151 20 cannon, standard equipment on most Luftwaffe fighters by 1943, carried 250 rounds per gun. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 with 4 20mm cannons thus carried 1,000 rounds total. The mathematics stated clearly, bringing down a single B-17 from the rear required expending every cannon shell the attacking fighter carried, assuming average marksmanship. This calculation did not account for defensive fire. The numbers assumed the fighter pilot could maintain his attack run, properly lead his target, and accurately fire his cannons, while simultaneously being engaged by multiple 50-caliber machine guns, whose tracer rounds created a visual environment that Luftwaffe pilots would later describe as swimming through wasps. Every attacking pilot faced a brutal truth. The time required to fire 1,000 cannon rounds at a target moving at 180 miles per hour exceeded the time available before defensive. Fire either killed the pilot, disabled the fighter, or forced a breakaway maneuver. The vulnerability analysis revealed another factor that would prove psychologically devastating to Luftwaffe fighter pilots. The 50-caliber Browning M2 had greater effective range than the German MG-17 machine gun used for sighting in fighter cannon fire. American gunners could begin engaging attackers at distances where German pilots could not yet accurately aim their heavier weapons. This meant that the approach to effective firing range occurred under defensive fire. Tracer rounds would be visible, streaking past the canopy, long before the attacking pilot reached the range where his weapons could strike with reliable accuracy. Klaus Fröhlich, the Messerschmitt pilot who had landed at Lerche that June morning, walked through Wolfhound's interior with growing comprehension of what American designers had created. He climbed into the ball turret and experienced the gunner's perspective. An unobstructed view of the lower hemisphere, twin 50-caliber guns that could traverse and elevate with power-assisted smoothness, the room enough for a small gunner to operate with reasonable comfort despite the cramped quarters. He sat in the tail position and understood why rear attacks had become so costly. The tail gunner could see any approaching fighter from miles away, had time to align his guns precisely, and could fire continuously throughout the fighter's attack run. He visited the dorsal turret and manipulated the controls that allowed rapid traverse and elevation. He examined the waist positions and noted their excellent fields of lateral fire. He stood in the radio operator's position and understood how this single, flexible gun covered the dorsal approach that fell between the nose and dorsal turret coverage zones. Every position showed evidence of careful design intended to eliminate defensive blind spots. The tour through Wolfhound lasted 3 hours. When Fröhlich emerged, he spoke to other fighter pilots who had been observing the captured bomber. His assessment was direct. Attacking this from any angle is likely to kill you. Attacking this in formation with other B-17 seconds is certainly going to kill you. The demonstration at Lerche Airfield in June 1943 was one of many organized by the Luftwaffe to familiarize fighter pilots with the B-17's capabilities and vulnerabilities. Wolfhound toured multiple bases throughout Germany and occupied France during spring and summer of 1943. At each location, fighter pilots walked through the aircraft, operated the gun positions, examined the structural strength, and participated in mock attacks so they could experience what American gunners saw when fighters approached. These educational tours served a specific purpose. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe losses to bomber defensive fire had reached levels that threatened operational capability. Fighter pilots were dying not primarily from mechanical failure or pilot error, but from defensive fire encountered during attacks on bomber formations. The Luftwaffe needed its pilots to understand exactly what they faced when they pressed home attacks against B-17 formations, and Wolfhound provided a tactile, visceral education that briefings and diagrams could not match. The intelligence gathered from examining captured B-17 seconds drove tactical evolution in Luftwaffe operations. German fighter pilots had initially approached American bomber formations with tactics developed against RAF, Lancaster, and Halifax bombers, which carried fewer defensive guns and had more limited coverage zones. These tactics involved extended firing passes from the rear quarter, allowing fighters to maintain visual contact with the target throughout the engagement, while staying within the relatively safe cone behind and slightly below the bomber. Against B-17 formations, rear quarter attacks proved suicidal. The tail guns, ball turret, and waist guns created overlapping fire that shredded fighters before they could close to effective range. Luftwaffe kill claims from late 1942 and early 1943 showed dramatically declining success rates for rear attacks compared to earlier operations against RAF bombers. German pilots reported that pressing attacks from behind felt like flying into a wall of tracers, with visibility obscured by the sheer volume of defensive fire and aircraft buffeted by near misses that created turbulence, even when shells didn't strike the fighter. Oberst Egon Meyer, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader II, developed the tactical response that would define Luftwaffe operations against B-17 seconds throughout 1943. Meyer had been studying bomber defensive capabilities for months, analyzing gun camera footage, interviewing surviving pilots, and examining battle damage on fighters that returned from bomber attacks. His conclusion: the only approach vector that offered acceptable survival probability was head-on. A head-on attack minimized time in the defensive fire zone. Closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour meant that the fighter passed through the bomber's maximum effective range in less than 2 seconds. This gave gunners minimal time to track, lead, and fire accurately. Additionally, head-on attacks in late 1942 and early 1943 exploited the B-17F's most significant defensive weakness: limited forward-firing armament. The B-17F carried only flexible guns in the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator, with restricted traverse and elevation limits. A fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high or 12 o'clock level faced only 2 guns rather than the 6 or 8 guns that engaged during rear quarter attacks. The head-on attack required extraordinary nerve and precision. The combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour gave pilots seconds to align, fire, and break away before collision. Poor gunnery meant wasting the entire attack. Delayed breakaway meant certain death. But the statistics supported the tactic. German intelligence calculated that head-on attacks required only 4 to 5 cannon hits to destroy a B-17, compared to 20 hits from the rear. The bomber's nose, flight deck, and forward fuselage contained critical systems: pilots, flight controls, engines that had less armor protection than the tail section where rear attacks concentrated fire. Meyer personally led the first massed head-on attack against American bomber formations on November 23, 1942. His Jagdgeschwader II intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds approaching Saint-Nazaire on the French coast. Meyer positioned his fighters 15 miles ahead of the bomber stream at slightly higher altitude. When the formation came into visual range, he led his staffel into a diving head-on pass, fighters in line astern spacing so each pilot had clear firing lanes. The attack devastated the lead squadron. Meyer's 20mm cannon fire struck the lead B-17's cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. The co-pilot attempted to maintain control, but with hydraulic systems destroyed and the pilot's body slumped against the controls, the bomber entered a steep dive that pulled 3 other aircraft out of formation as they maneuvered to avoid collision. Mayer's wingman scored hits on a second bomber's No. 1 and No. 2 engines. The aircraft fell away, trailing smoke, eventually ditching in the channel where the crew was lost. Other pilots in the formation reported similar results. The head-on pass allowed German fighters to concentrate fire on the most vulnerable portions of the bomber's forward structure. Cannon shells that struck the nose section could kill bombardiers and navigators. Shells, penetrating the flight deck, killed or wounded pilots. Shells striking engines from the front had higher probability of causing immediate catastrophic damage compared to rear attacks, where engine armor provided more protection. Most importantly, the head-on attack minimized exposure to defensive fire. Pilots reported spending perhaps 2 to 3 seconds in effective range of nose guns compared to 15 or 20 seconds during rear quarter attacks. Word of Mayer's success spread rapidly through Luftwaffe fighter units. By January 1943, head-on attacks had become standard doctrine for engaging B-17 formations. Fighter groups developed specialized tactics for these attacks. Initial positioning well ahead and above the bomber stream, diving approach to build speed, firing from approximately 800 yards to 300 yards, breakaway by pulling up and rolling to either side to avoid collision and to minimize profile presented to defensive gunners. The American response demonstrated the 8th Air Force's organizational adaptability. Intelligence officers conducting debriefings noted the shift in Luftwaffe tactics. Bomber crews reported increasing numbers of head-on attacks with devastating results to lead aircraft. Mission loss statistics showed disproportionate casualties among formation leaders who bore the brunt of frontal assaults. The evidence demanded modification of bomber defensive capabilities. Boeing engineers, working with 8th Air Force technical staff, developed the chin turret modification that would characterize the B-17G model. The chin turret mounted 2 .50 caliber machine guns in a power-operated Bendix turret positioned directly below the bombardier's station. The bombardier controlled the turret through a computing gun sight that calculated lead angles and provided firing solutions. 2 additional flexible guns mounted in cheek positions on either side of the nose supplemented the chin turret, giving the B-17G 4 forward-firing guns compared to the B-17F's 2 flexible guns. The B-17G entered service in August 1943. The first combat missions with chin turret-equipped aircraft occurred in September. German fighter pilots immediately noticed the increased forward firepower. Luftwaffe after-action reports from September and October 1943 documented that head-on attacks no longer provided the asymmetric advantage they had offered against B-17Fs. The chin turret, operated by a trained bombardier using computing gun sights, could track approaching fighters with accuracy that flexible nose guns could not match. The additional cheek guns provided suppressive fire that forced German pilots to break away earlier or accept increased risk of being hit. The evolutionary arms race between bomber defensive armament and fighter tactics accelerated throughout 1943. As American bombers added guns, German fighters added heavier weapons. The Mk 108 30mm cannon, entering service on Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s in mid-1943, required only 4 hits to destroy a B-17 compared to 20 hits from 20mm weapons. The trade-off was substantially lower muzzle velocity, 500 meters per second compared to 800 meters per second for the MG-151-20, which made accurate aiming more difficult and required closer approach to effective range. German bomber-destroyer units, designated Sturmgruppen, evolved specifically to counter American heavy bomber formations. These specialized units flew FW-190s equipped with heavy armor protection around the cockpit, 4 30mm Mk108 cannons, and twin 13mm MG-131 machine guns. The armor allowed pilots to withstand defensive fire long enough to close to point-blank range, where the 30mm cannons could deliver killing hits. Sturmgruppen tactics emphasized pressing attacks to extremely close range, often within 150 meters, where miss probability approached zero. Hauptmann Rolf Herrmichen, who commanded a Sturmgruppe during summer 1944, described the psychological experience of attacking B-17 formations in close formation with heavily armored fighters. You commit completely to the attack run. You accept that you will be hit. The armor will protect you, or it won't. What matters is getting close enough that every trigger pull produces hits. At 100 meters, you cannot miss. The bomber fills your entire windscreen. You fire, you see strikes, you see pieces flying off, and then you are through the formation or dead. The willingness to accept probable death or injury in order to achieve mission success characterized Sturmgruppen operations. These units achieved kill ratios substantially higher than standard fighter groups, but their casualty rates were catastrophic. Losses of 30 to 40% per mission were routine. Replacement pilots rarely survived more than 3 or 4 missions before being killed or wounded. The concept worked tactically but proved unsustainable operationally. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked sufficient experienced pilots to maintain Sturmgruppen at effective strength, while Meyer developed head-on tactics and Herrmichen led armor-protected close attacks. Hans-Werner Lerche continued evaluating captured B-17 seconds at Rechlin. After Wolfhound, several additional flying fortresses fell into German hands through forced landings or successful recoveries of crashed aircraft. Each captured bomber underwent systematic evaluation. Lerche flew multiple types, comparing B-17Fs to B-17Gs, examining differences in defensive armament, testing engine outperformance under various loading conditions, and measuring control forces required for combat maneuvers. His evaluation reports, classified secret, and distributed only to senior Luftwaffe officers and technical staff, provided comprehensive analysis of B-17 strengths and vulnerabilities. The strengths list was substantial. Excellent structural integrity that allowed aircraft to absorb massive battle damage and continue flying, redundant flight control systems that provided controllability even with primary systems destroyed, powerful engines with sufficient margin to maintain formation even with one engine failed, comprehensive defensive armament that created overlapping fields of fire throughout 360 degrees. The vulnerabilities list was shorter but significant. Limited frontal armor protection on early models allowed head-on attacks to prove effective. Dependence on tight formation integrity for mutual defensive support meant that isolated aircraft became vulnerable to concentrated attack. Requirement to fly straight and level during bomb runs prevented evasive maneuvering when under attack. Lerche noted in his reports that the B-17's greatest vulnerability was not technical but tactical. American doctrine required bombers to maintain rigid formation and predictable flight paths, which allowed German fighters and flak batteries to concentrate fire effectively. The captured B-17 seconds that German pilots examined and flew provided intelligence that shaped Luftwaffe operations throughout the European Air War. But perhaps more significantly, they provided psychological evidence of American industrial and technological capabilities that some German officers found deeply unsettling. Wolfhound and her sister aircraft demonstrated manufacturing quality, engineering sophistication, and attention to crew survivability that exceeded anything Luftwaffe bombers offered their crews. German bomber pilots examining captured B-17 seconds noted features that seemed wasteful from German design perspectives, but clearly reflected different philosophical approaches. The comprehensive defensive armament represented weight and complexity that reduced bomb load and performance, but dramatically increased crew survival probability. The heavy armor plating around critical systems reduced payload capacity, but allowed damaged bombers to return home with wounded crew. The redundant flight controls, multiple oxygen systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and sophisticated communication equipment all consumed weight budget that could have been devoted to additional ordnance or fuel, but all increased mission success probability and crew survival rates. These design choices reflected fundamentally different calculations of value. American designers apparently considered trained crews more valuable than maximum bomb tonnage per mission. The B-17 was designed to bring crews home, even at the cost of reduced offensive capability. German bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88 prioritized speed and bomb load over crew protection, accepting higher loss rates in exchange for greater strike capability per aircraft. Neither approach was inherently correct, but they produced measurably different outcomes in crew casualty statistics and bomber loss rates. By late 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence had accumulated sufficient data on B-17 operations to assess the bomber's effectiveness comprehensively. The statistics told a complex story. B-17 seconds, operating in tight combat box formations with fighter escort, could penetrate German airspace, strike targets, and return with acceptable loss rates that American industrial production could sustain indefinitely. Individual B-17 seconds separated from formation protection proved vulnerable to concentrated fighter attack despite their defensive armament. B-17 formations without fighter escort suffered catastrophic losses that exceeded sustainable replacement rates, as demonstrated during the Schweinfurt raids, where 20 to 26% loss rates forced temporary suspension of deep penetration missions. The captured B-17 seconds also served operational purposes beyond intelligence gathering. Kampfgeschwader 200, a Luftwaffe Special Operations Unit, operated approximately 7 captured flying fortresses on various clandestine missions throughout 1943 and 1944. These aircraft, painted in full German markings and designated with cover designations Dornier Do 200 and Dornier Do 288 to confuse Allied intelligence, conducted long-range reconnaissance flights, agent insertion operations, and supply missions to isolated German positions behind enemy lines. KG-200 pilots praised the B-17's handling characteristics and exceptional range. Captain Wilhelm Roos, who commanded one of KG-200's Staffeln operating captured aircraft, wrote in his log that the B-17 was a pilot's aircraft, responsive and forgiving, with reserves of power and control authority that inspire confidence. He noted that the bomber's rugged construction allowed operations from grass fields that would damage more delicately built German aircraft. The reliable Wright Cyclone engines rarely failed, and when they did, the aircraft continued flying on remaining engines without excessive difficulty. But KG-200's operations with captured B-17 seconds were not without risk. On May 15, 1944, a B-17 coded A3+FB was intercepted by Allied fighters over Belgium during a return flight from a reconnaissance mission to France. The aircraft, lacking escort and with no element of surprise once identified, fell under attack from P-51 Mustangs. Despite the gunners' defensive fire, the concentrated attack from multiple fighters quickly disabled 2 engines and wounded several crew members. The pilot managed to divert to an emergency landing at a German-controlled airfield, but the aircraft was damaged beyond economical repair. Another B-17 operated by KG-200, coded A3+CE, was lost on June 27. 1944 during a mission over the Mediterranean. A third crashed on November 19, 1944, after sustaining damage during a mission to the Spanish-French border area. By early 1945, only 2 or 3 captured B-17 seconds remained operational with KG-200, and these conducted only limited operations as Allied air superiority over Europe became absolute. The examination of captured B-17 seconds also influenced German aircraft design, though by 1944 it was too late for these influences to affect war outcomes. German engineers studying B-17 systems noted particular interest in the supercharger installation that gave American bombers excellent high-altitude performance, the electrical systems that powered gun turrets with reliability German hydraulic systems could not match, and the oxygen systems that allowed crew to operate effectively at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet for extended periods. Some concepts from B-17 examination appeared in late-war German aircraft designs. The Arado R-2 34 jet bomber, developed in late 1944, incorporated tail turret concepts derived from study of American defensive armament. The Junkers Ju-390 long-range reconnaissance aircraft used electrical systems influenced by B-17 examination. But these aircraft entered service too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat operations meaningfully. The most significant legacy of examining captured B-17 seconds was the tactical evolution it drove in Luftwaffe fighter operations. By understanding exactly what they faced when attacking American bomber formations, German fighter pilots developed techniques that maximized killing probability while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. These techniques, head-on attacks, massed formations pressing to close range, the use of heavy cannons capable of killing with minimal hits represented rational tactical responses to the defensive capabilities that captured B-17 seconds revealed. But tactical sophistication could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in industrial capacity and resource availability. By mid-1944, when American fighter escorts achieved sufficient range to accompany bombers to any target in Germany, the Luftwaffe's ability to inflict sustainable losses on bomber formations collapsed. German fighters now faced not only the defensive firepower of bomber formations, but also offensive fighter sweeps by P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, specifically hunting interceptors. Klaus Friedrich, the pilot who had examined Wolfhound at Laz in June 1943, was shot down by a P-51 Mustang on March 6, 1944, while attempting to attack a B-17 formation over Berlin. He survived with severe burns and was invalided out of combat operations. After the war, he was interviewed by American intelligence officers conducting studies of German fighter tactics. His assessment of attacking B-17 formations was succinct. It was necessary, it was our duty. But from a pilot's perspective, it was suicidal. Every attack meant flying into concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. Survival was luck more than skill. Egon Meyer, who developed the head-on attack tactics that became standard Luftwaffe procedure, was killed on March 2, 1944 during combat with Allied fighters. He had achieved 102 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots. His death in combat against fighters rather than bombers demonstrated the shift in operational conditions that occurred when long-range escorts eliminated the Luftwaffe's ability to attack bomber formations without first defeating fighter screens. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war, completing his last operational flight on April 23, 1945, when he flew a Dornier Du 335 from Rechlin to Oberpfaffenhofen, just days before Germany's surrender. Throughout his career, he had flown over 125 different aircraft types, including virtually every major Allied aircraft that fell into German hands. His post-war memoir, published in 1977 and translated to English in 1980, provided detailed technical assessments of Allied aircraft from a German test pilot's perspective. His B-17 evaluations confirmed what combat pilots had learned through bitter experience. The Flying Fortress was brilliantly designed to survive in hostile airspace and bring crews home alive. Wolfhound, the B-17F that fell into German hands on December 12, 1942, eventually was transferred to KG-200 after its evaluation period at Rechlin. It operated on multiple missions throughout 1943 and into 1944. Records indicate the aircraft was still flying missions as late as November 1944. Its ultimate fate remains unclear. It likely was destroyed during Allied bombing raids on German airfields, or abandoned as the front collapsed in early 1945. The story of German pilots flying captured B-17 seconds provides insight into how military organizations respond when confronted with enemy capabilities that exceed expectations. The initial encounter with intact B-17 seconds revealed defensive armament arrangements far more comprehensive than intelligence assessments had indicated. Walking through Wolfhound's interior, sitting in gun positions, manipulating turret controls, German pilots gained visceral understanding of what they faced when attacking bomber formations. That understanding drove tactical evolution that sought to minimize exposure to defensive fire while maximizing hitting probability. But technical understanding could not overcome fundamental realities. The B-17's defensive concept comprehensive armament, creating overlapping fields of fire throughout 360 degrees, meant that every attack vector brought fighters into engagement zones where multiple guns could fire simultaneously. The mathematics remained brutally simple. Achieving 20 hits from 20mm cannons required firing 1,000 rounds while being engaged by defensive fire exceeding 2,000 rounds per minute. German pilots faced a kill ratio calculation where even successful attacks often resulted in their own deaths or disabling damage to their aircraft. The phrase flying porcupine that German pilots used to describe B-17 formations captured this reality perfectly. Porcupines are covered with quills in all directions. There is no safe approach. Any contact produces injury. B-17 formations, with their overlapping defensive fire, created the aerial equivalent. Any attack produced exposure to defensive fire. Close-range attacks necessary for killing probability increased defensive fire exposure proportionally. The only variable pilots could control was duration of exposure by using high-speed head-on attacks that minimized time in the defensive fire zone. The American bombing campaign's eventual success rested not on bomber invulnerability but on ability to sustain operations despite losses. The United States produced over 12,700 B-17 seconds during the war. Training facilities graduated sufficient crews to replace combat losses and expand operational strength simultaneously. Industrial capacity allowed replacement of destroyed bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them. This combination of production capability and crew training capacity meant that American forces could accept loss rates that would have crippled less industrially developed nations. German examination of captured B-17 seconds revealed a weapon system designed for sustained operations in hostile airspace. The comprehensive defensive armament, redundant systems, protective armor, and structural strength all reflected design choices that prioritized mission completion and crew survival over maximum performance or bomb load. These priorities produced a bomber that individual fighters found extremely difficult to destroy quickly, forcing German defenders to concentrate multiple fighters against single bombers to achieve kills. That concentration requirement meant fewer fighters available to engage the broader bomber stream, which allowed more bombers to reach targets and complete missions. The intelligence gathered from captured B-17 seconds fundamentally shaped how German pilots approached combat for the remainder of the war. It drove tactical innovation in attack techniques. It influenced weapon development toward heavier cannons capable of killing with fewer hits. It affected fighter design toward more heavily armored models, capable of withstanding defensive fire during close-range attacks. None of these adaptations proved sufficient to stop the American bombing campaign, but they were rational responses to capabilities that examination of captured aircraft revealed. The psychological impact of flying captured B-17 seconds on German test pilots and fighter leaders deserves consideration. These men understood immediately that they faced opponents with substantial industrial, technological, and logistical advantages. The B-17's quality of construction, sophistication of systems, and comprehensive approach to crew protection demonstrated capabilities that Germany's strained industrial base could not match. Walking through Wolfhound, German pilots saw tangible evidence of American strength that no intelligence briefing could convey as powerfully. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.